Migration by Brickshane, Sophia, and Max. Vocabulary. Immigration is migration from a location. Immigration is migration to a new location. Migration is a form of relocation diffusion involving a permanent move to a new location. Net migration is the difference between the level of immigration and level of immigration. Internal migration, permanent movement within a particular country. International migration, permanent movement from one country to another. Intra-regional migration, permanent movement within one region of a country. Remittance is a transfer of money by workers to people in the country from which they immigrated.
Chapter 3, Key Issue 1. The migration transition helps us understand where migrants move and why. This produces the demographic transition model. In stage 1, we see high birth rates and a high death rate. For migration transition patterns in stage 1, we see seasonal mobility in search of food. In stage 2, there's a high birth rate and a rapidly declining death rate. In the migration transition, we see a high international immigration and an interregional migration from rural to urban areas. In stage 3, we see a rapidly declining birth rate and declining death rate. We also see a high international immigration and an interregional migration from cities to suburbs. In stage 4, we see a low birth rate and a low death rate. The migration transition is the same as stage 3. For distance of migration, the two main ideas are that most migrants relocate a short distance and remain in the same country. The other main idea is that long-distance migrants move to other countries and usually move to cities. Voluntary migration is where the migrant chooses to move, maybe for the economic improvement. Forced migration is when a migrant is forced to move due to political or environmental factors. International migration patterns. The patterns that we see are people moving from Asia to Europe, people move from Asia to North America, and people also move from Latin America to North America. The U.S. immigration patterns. During the 17th and 18th centuries, people from Europe relocate and start their new lives in the New World voluntarily. And also, people from sub-Saharan Africa are forced to migrate as, as slaves. During the late 19th and 20th century in Ireland and Germany, there was enormous economic and political unrest due to the potato famine. People started to leave Ireland and came to the United States. In the late 1800s, Scandinavia people migrated to the US due to the Industrial Revolution. Also, as well, in the 1900s from Southern and Eastern Europe. In the late 20th and 21st centuries, rapid population growth happened due to Asian and Latin American growth in the US.
Chapter 3, Key Issue 2. Where do people migrate within countries? And this slide is going to follow on interregional migration in the United States. And it begins in 1790 in the coast. And this location reflects the fact that during the colonial era, settlements all had to be near the Atlantic coast because they depended a lot on shipping links with Europe in order to like receive products and to export their own products and like raw materials. And also the Appalachian Mountains would help hinder Western development because they had few gaps that allowed passage and they had very thick forests and steep slopes. And also, Native Americans inhabited large portions of land still at the time, so it was very hard to expand their own settlements. Second off, the Appalachians in the 1800s to 1840s, because of transformation improvements, especially the building of canals in the Northeast, it helped open basically America at the time, and people began moving into more forested river valleys between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River because they were all promised a large amount of land at a very inexpensive price. Similar to that, instead of moving immediately to the next westward land, during the gold rush in 1850 and 1890, they moved immediately to California because of the gold rush and the discovery of gold. And pioneers all moved immediately to California because of this event or this discovery. Fourth off is the Great Plains in 1900 to 1940, which had a lot of interregional migration in that era because immigration from Europe to the East Coast filled up the Great Plains, which was a place that in the past people had ignored and deemed useless because of its dry climate and its lack of trees. But technological advances made these areas more useful for agriculture, and the expansion of railroads also made it easier to settle in the Great Plains. So, as times changed, it was more easy to live in the Great Plains as it was in the past. Last off is the South from 1950 to 2010. And more people moved to the South at this time because they wanted more job opportunities and they were promised a warmer climate. There's a rapid growth of population and employment in the South during this time, and many industries relocated from the Northeast and the Midwest to the South because of the industrial growth at the time and newly established companies. And then there is interregional migration in other large countries, such as China. And then there were more than 150 million Chinese who immigrated from rural areas to urban areas because there were a lot of factory jobs in urban areas. And at the same time, government was afraid that this migration into urban areas would lead to poor living conditions because they believed that a lot more people should have been working in agriculture. So China's government had lifted many of the restrictions on migration in recent years, but they had many because they didn't want the urban areas growing in any certain way, in any way at all. Second off, it's Brazil, where most of Brazil's populations reside near the east coast. And then their tropical interior was very empty and had hardly any people living in it. To increase the attractiveness of that same area, the government had moved its capital in 1960 to a newly built city called Brasilia. Development of Brazil's interior had altered historical migration patterns into the large urban areas onto the coast. Due to this, the coastal areas would now have net out migration, whereas the interior areas had net in migration. So that whole plan had worked at the end. Third of all is Canada, and like the United States, it had more interregional migration from east to west for more than a century. And plus, Alberta had the largest net in migration, and Quebec had the largest net out migration. The three largest interprovincial flows in Canada are from Ontario to Alberta, from British Columbia to Alberta, and from Alberta to British Columbia. Last off in this slide is the interregional migration in Russia, of which the Soviet government had forced a lot of people to undertake interregional migration because it was highly clustered in the Western or European portion of the country. To open up the very few inhabited Asian portion of Russia, so then Soviet policy encouraged a lot of factory construction near raw materials rather than near existing population concentrations. And then they wanted to build up an adequate labor force, so the Soviet government had to force people. Interregional migration from rural to urban areas initially began in the 1800s in Europe and North America as part of the Industrial Revolution. And as with interregional migrants, most people who move from rural to urban areas seek economic advancement, and they are pushed from rural areas by declining opportunities in agriculture. From urban to suburban areas, most interregional migration in developed countries is from cities to surrounding suburbs. The population of most cities in developed countries has declined very rapidly since the mid 20th century, while, on the other hand, have actually grown. Nearly twice as many Americans migrate from cities to suburbs each year as they would migrate from suburbs to cities. Similar patterns are found in Canada and Europe, but also the major reason for the large scale migration to the suburbs is not at all related to employment. It's a lot more it's a lot more influenced by the lifestyle and having an opportunity to get away from the chaos of an urban life. From urban to rural areas, counter-urbanization, which is the net migration from urban to rural areas, basically had started happening recently in the late 20th century. Very similarly to suburbanization, people would move from urban to rural areas for the same lifestyle reasons and to get away from that whole crazy pace of urban life and for the opportunity to live on a farm, even though they would not use that as their main source of income. They would actually work in nearby offices, small towns, and shops or other services. Some rural counties in states such as Colorado, Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming have also experienced a lot of net in migration in recent years.
Chapter 3, Key Issue 3. Why do people migrate? According to Regenstein's laws, um, these laws help geographers explain why people migrate. Many people migrate for economic reasons and also political and environmental reasons. Political reasons for migrating: push factor, pull and pull factors. Push factor makes people move out of their present location. Pull factor makes people move into a new location. Intervening obstacle: environmental or political feature that hinders migration. Push and pull factors are very important to migrating. Some people get pushed away due to negative factors in their environment. Pull factors made people that were living in a negative environment be attracted to other positive factors in other locations. Migrating can be affected by intervening obstacles, but since now transportation has improved, the main obstacles are political ones. Forced political migration. The UNHCR recognizes three groups of people who are forced to migrate for political reasons. Refugees, they are forced to migrate to another country to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights, disasters, cannot return for fear of persecution due to race, religion, with uh, nationality, membership in a social group, and political opinions. Internally displaced person, also known as IDP, are forced to migrate for similar political reasons as refugees, but hasn't migrated across an international border. Asylum seeker, someone who has who has migrated to another country in the hope of being recognized as a refugee. Large numbers of refugees in 2017 were forced to migrate from Afghanistan, Syria, South Sudan, and Myanmar. Okay. Large number of refugees in 2017 were forced to migrate from Afghanistan, Syria. Large number of refugees in 2017 were forced to migrate from Afghanistan, Syria, Large number of refugees in 2017 were forced to migrate from Afghanistan, Syria, South Sudan, and Myanmar due to the continuing civil war in many of these countries. Push and pull factors. Migrants are sometimes pushed from their homes by adverse physical conditions like water. Even though, even if it's too much or too little, it possesses the most common environmental threat. Floodplain. An area subject to flooding during a specific number of years based on historical trends. Examples of push factor can be hurricanes, such as Hurricane Katrina, Harvey, and Maria, which caused many people to migrate due to how big of a disaster the hurricane caused. A pull factor can be attractive environments for migrants which include mountains, seasides, and warm climates. People who like to live near Rocky Mountains usually migrate to places like Colorado or the Alps. Individuals that tend to like more warm weather usually migrate to southwest regions. Others that like to live by the ocean mostly migrate to the coast of Florida or California. Economic migration. In developing countries, people are unable to migrate permanently to a new country for employment opportunities, may be allowed to migrate temporarily. South and East Asia, world's largest sources of migrants in search of immigrate from East, South and East Asia. Over 2 million people immigrate from India, Bangladesh, and China, and Pakistan. US is the leading receiving country. Largest number of Chinese immigrants are in Thailand. Southwest Asia um, are well have wealthy oil producing countries of Southwest Asia have been major destinations for people from South Asian countries of India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and the Philippines and Thailand. Immigrants comprise 84% of the population of the UAE. In developed countries, which are the US and Canada, have been especially prominent destinations for economic migrants. Lots of European immigrants to North America in the 19th century expected a lot from the US. US and Canada offered European prospects for economic advancement. The US and Canada being seen that they have a high economic potential and attract people from Latin America and Asia. Economic migrants are generally not admitted unless they possess special skills or have a close relative already there, but they are obligated to compete with other people from other countries. Gender and age of migrants. Age of migrants, according to Ravenstein's theory, was that many of the long distance migrants are young adults and not elder or young children. Individuals between 20 and 39 are about 49% of immigrants. 5% of recent US immigrants are over the age of 65. In LDCs, 8% elderly immigrant elderly immigrants. Children below the age of 20 are 21% of immigrants lower than 26 share in the US. In LDCs, children under the age of 20 are 35% of the total population, but 23 of the migrants. The number of unoccupied minors that have tried to cross the border have increased severely. About 90% are males ages of 12 to 17 years old. Gender. Ravenstein's theory was that males usually migrate longer distance rather than women. This is due to males seeking for job opportunities. In the 19th and much of the 20th century, 55% of immigrants were male. In 1970, about 55% of our of are female immigrants. Um, Two factors contributing to the large share of females migrating to LDCs are lots of people migrate to MDCs. I mean, to Two factors contributing to the large share of females migrating to MDCs. Lots of people migrate to MDCs for jobs. The high percent of women in labor force in these countries usually has a higher percent of female immigrants. MDCs allow wives to join husbands who have already migrated to those areas/countries.
Chapter 3, Key Issue 4: Obstacles for Migrants. Intervening obstacles is an environmental or political feature that hinders migration. This is something that stops you from being able to move. Back then, the obstacle was the environment, like crossing an ocean or a mountain. Now, the obstacle is more of political situations, like borders which keep the migrants out legally, such as the border in Tijuana and San Diego. Quota laws. Quota is something that sets maximum limits on the number of people who could immigrate into the U.S. during a year. Back in the 17, 18, early 1900s, there was no quota laws. Anyone who wanted to move into the U.S. could. In 1921, they initiated the Quota Act and the National Origins Act in 1924, which limited people and became an intervening obstacle. It was designed to allow people of European descent to come into the country, but it was meant to keep people out from other regions because European descent was similar to the people's background in the United States, while people from other regions were not, and they wanted it to be people who were similar to them and not different. Unauthorized immigration. Unauthorized immigrants is an immigrant entering a country without the correct documents. 11.2 million immigrants in the U.S. as of 2010 are unauthorized immigrants. 58% is from Mexico and the rest are from other Latin countries. 1 million are children, but if the child is born in the US, they are automatically citizens. 8 million are employed in the US. Their jobs mainly consist of construction and hospitality. Mexico's border. The US and Mexico border is 1,951 miles long. The barriers cover only one-fourth of the border. This border runs through the inhabited regions, and it is also guarded by a handful of agents and Border Patrol. Characteristics of immigrants by Ravenstein. Most long distance migrants are male. Most long distance migrants are adult individuals instead of elderly or younger people. In the US, 40% are young adults ages from 25 to 39. This is less likely to be elderly people, and more children are coming over with their mothers. The gender of migrants. This used to be mainly male, but now it's more females migrating.